Hi everyone and welcome along to our DIY spring wreath tutorial. Thank you so much for ordering the kits. I hope you love them. I hope you've unboxed them and thought, wow, what a beautiful selection of flowers. And I hope you're ready for some relaxation, some time to be creative and to just enjoy a moment and create something really, really beautiful. I'm going to talk you through each step, all of the components that we have in your kits, and go through each step by step of the process of making your wreath. It's so easy. I know it might seem a bit daunting, but hopefully you'll really enjoy it. And yeah, let's crack on. Okay, so in your kit you will have received a wire frame wreath ring. We've gone for raised this time. I know at Christmas we used the flat ones, but I feel like I've converted to a raised ring. It seems to make a sort of deeper, more kind of fuller wreath. So let me know what you think if you've used both. I'd love to know your thoughts. So that's the wreath ring. We've got some gorgeous fresh sphagnum moss, which I've given a really good drink to actually. When you receive your kit, it might feel a bit dry, mainly because it's easier for shipping in terms of the packaging that we use. So give it a nice water, just stick it in a bowl and pop it under the tap and get it nice and damp, because this is going to keep your wreath fresher for longer. We've also got some lovely pistache. It's a really good foliage, a really easy foliage to work with and lasts for a really long time. It's not necessarily the most aesthetically pleasing foliage that there is. It's not, you know, kind of like the olive or maybe some eucalyptus or that kind of thing, but it does create a really, really good cushion and a backdrop for all of your flowers. So yeah, the pistache is a really good one. We've also got some olive, my absolute favourite. It's a really good foliage for kind of creating slightly longer lengths to make it feel a bit more rustic and a bit more natural. So those are the two kind of main foliages. We've then got some white wax flower, which is a really good floral for outside, out of sort of direct water. It dries really well. It smells like lemongrass when you cut it. So cut it down and see what you think, see if you can smell it. It's a really gorgeous floral there. Then moving on to the slightly brighter florals, we've got an array of sorbet pastel kind of really spring fresh colours. We have got some blue mascari, one of my absolute favourites. The little bells are just absolutely gorgeous. I love it. The colour of the blue is perfect. Some really gorgeously scented hyacinths, just the epitome of spring really, aren't they? We've got some pinky salmon-y kind of ruffled ranunculus, again such a spring favourite. Some peachy orangey tulips, a whole bunch actually of genista, which is just, oh, heaven, really. The smell is just spring all over, so I really hope you enjoy that. Some pink tulips, double tulips, so they're lovely and frilly and sort of ruffled. Some white carnations. Now, carnations have a bad rep, but I personally think that they have a place. So they're really good for adding a bit of texture and also adding a bit of contrast to the more sort of brighter colours that you have. If you mix colour with white, it really sort of adds, it really adds to that kind of depth of colour and makes the colours pop more when you've got some white there. We've also got some really cute yellow cruspedia or billy bobs. They dry really nicely. And then, bear with me on this, I've added in some faux eggs. Now, usually I use real quail's eggs in my wreaths, but this year I haven't for the wreath kits, mainly because they are a nightmare to use. They crack and they split, and you have to wire them to add them into your wreath, which, you know, if you're experienced in wire work, it's fine. I struggle sometimes, so I must admit, but this is going to be a lot easier for you to put into your wreaths. It's going to be a lot less stressful, and it would be really enjoyable, just because you can just stick these skewers right in. So although not authentic, they still look the part, and I think you'll find them much easier to use. Okay, so let's begin our wreaths. The first thing you need to do is take your binding wire. So you'll all have a reel of binding wire in your kit. You need either a pair of secateurs or some scissors. The scissors are more for cutting the twine at the end. You have some in your kit just to hang with. Ideally secateurs, that would be the ideal thing to use. So if you take your binding wire and wrap it round the top ring of your frame, just to secure it. We're then going to make a zigzag pattern over the frame. You'll notice that there is a sort of wider zigzag pattern already on there. We want to sort of almost double up and make that more sort of supportive to when we place the moss on. So you're going to go over and under with your wire. In essence, just so the moss doesn't sort of fall through the gaps. So if you have that in your head, that you need to kind of create that framework for the moss to sit on. So if you have that in mind when working out how close to go, so you're just creating like a zigzag pattern just to put together a framework for your moss. Okay. So now I've given my moss a really good drink, and I'm just going to take a handful. This is sphagnum moss, fresh sphagnum moss. And I'm going to place it on top of the frame that you've just created, and again bind round, so up and over and under. Now the purpose of the moss is to provide your flowers and foliage and your wreath with its sort of watering source, I guess. So ideally it will be pretty damp. After you've finished mossing your wreath ring, you can add more water to it. You know, in an ideal world, you'd go outside and put a hose pipe over it and just give it a really good drink. Okay, so placing on your framework, up, over and back through, up, over, back through. I would say if this is going on the door, try and cover, if you can, the interior hoop that you have. You won't see the outside copper ring once your wreath is made, but you may see elements of your interior ring here. So it's best just to kind of try and cover it with as much moss as you can. You can be quite generous with your moss. Nearly there. Once you've finished adding your moss, don't cut your binding wire. Keep it attached. Okay, so that's your masked wreath ring. So pop that down and we will start to cut down all of the foliage and the florals as well. So move that to one side. Okay, so if we begin with the pistache, so this is quite an easy foliage to cut down because it sort of lends itself into prongs that are really simple, and there's not too many leaves lower down the stem. If you would like your wreath to be quite rustic, quite wild, you'll be aiming for a slightly longer stem, so cutting it so that they're longer. If you want your wreath to be quite structured and quite compact, and probably by doing so making it more floral looking and a bit brighter, because all of the florals will be in sort of a shorter area on your wreath, then I would be cutting it slightly shorter. I personally like this sort of colourful wreath to be quite natural and organic, but probably not as wild and whimsical as I would say do an all foliage wreath, or something that's maybe a bit more neutral in colour. So I'm aiming for a kind of cut or a size of stem that's sort of about this. So what's that? 7 inches? But again, it doesn't have to be perfect. It can be shorter and slightly long or slightly longer. So you're aiming for this kind of thing with the pistache. Like that. And then start to create your piles as you break everything down. Can I move these over? It's best to go, if you're unsure, best to go longer where you cut, because you can always trim it as you lay it on your wreath and see what the kind of feel that you want for it. Okay, there we go. That's your nice pile of pistache foliage. And now we'll move on to the olive. So the olive is to provide sort of touches of that foliage, and almost to kind of keep them a bit longer. So I would keep my stems of olive along those lines. Once you've cut sort of sections off and you're left with something that looks like this, so probably not the prettiest thing, I would still cut it down and I would still pop it in the pile, because it can be used as a sort of a background and just to create that depth where you won't see any of this, but it adds that sort of a lift. So keep all the bits that would ordinarily end up on the floor. Okay. So again, just to show you some of the sections. So I'd say it's sort of 6-7 inches long. Some of them are a bit longer, but again, I would always cut them slightly on the longer side to begin with, because you can always trim them down if you want to. So we have our olive and our pistache. Moving on to the white wax flower. So with the wax flower, this can be slightly shorter. So you're kind of trimming it down to sections like this. And then if you have a section where it's the main stem and you've got the sort of stems coming off, keep them. Even if they're sort of that short, keep them, because they can be placed on top of the posies that I'm going to show you how to make in a moment. There's definitely no need to waste anything. Everything can be cut down. So for example there, I just cut off a teeny tiny sort of stem there, but it still adds something, still adds a bit of texture. So just try and keep as much as you can, you know, discarding obviously stems like this. With the wax flower, I wouldn't necessarily personally use it to create a wilder look in terms of, I keep the wax flower sort of a bit shorter, so it's more in the main kind of area of the wreath. I wouldn't use it to create that sort of wild texture around the edge. That's what I would use the olive for. That's what I will use for the genista for. So keep the wax flower, you know, relatively not short, but not the longest. Okay, so that's our pile of wax flower. Going to cut down the genista next. Goes along. So with your bunch of genista, for each individual stem, you could probably get 2 or 3 sections out of it. So if you find sort of the main stem, and then cutting it in sections off the main stem. So I'm left with sort of a V shape there, and then that is sort of the top, if that makes sense. So it's quite long, smells amazing, and it adds to that texture, because you don't, well, I wouldn't suggest that you would put an entire kind of stem of that, because it's quite a blocky kind of section of colour or sort of just one element. You kind of want to break it down so that it's amongst the entire wreath and interwoven with all the other ingredients, rather than sort of place smack bang there, sort of, and not sort of adding that texture in a way that you can. So just break it down into sections. And if you imagine you're going to be creating possibly between 10 and 12 different posies of all of the ingredients. So by breaking it down, you're really stretching it out so that you've got sections of everything around the entire wreath. Now there is a place for if you want to cluster things. So if you want to say cluster probably more of the really heavily floral elements, that's absolutely fine. So if you want to have an area where it's just all tulips, or you know, if you want to put all the eggs in one area, so that's a cluster, then that's fine. But when it comes to the foliages and for sure the genista, which is this, I would be spreading it out throughout the whole wreath. There we go, that's the genista done. So let's move on to the hyacinths. So you have 3 hyacinths in your box. I would be probably aiming to cut about there. Now I dropped one of mine earlier on, so one of mine is broken, although okay, thought it was broken. Yours will be more in bud than mine, but you can also use the lovely little kind of hidden stems as well, the babies. So don't waste any of those, because they just add something else, don't they? They just add another textural element. And then discard the bulbs. Okay, so now you have 3 ranunculus. And again, I would probably cut around that kind of, so what would we say, with the head included, 4 inches. And if you have any of these, the buds, keep those too, because they're lovely. So cut those down as well. The tulips, I would go the same, with 4 inches. Again, we can always trim if we need to. So in total you have 10 tulips, 5 of the kind of peachy orange and 5 of the double pinks. If you find that some of your tulips are quite tight and have the leaf structure quite close to the bud, you know, by all means leave them on, because they add another element again, and they're quite pretty. The pink ones can be sort of almost serrated in, serrated? Two-tone, white and green. Serrated, don't know. So keep them on if they are close, so, you know, for example, like that. Okay. And then the white carnation's the same. About 4 inches. Pop those in the pile. The billy bobs. Now with the billy bobs, you might want these to be quite long and therefore wild around your wreath. Up to you. I personally am going to have them in amongst the florals, so I'm probably going to cut them at about 5 inches or so. The mascari, actually you probably don't need to trim, you can leave that as it is. And then the eggs, which will pop in at the end, they just poke through. I'll probably kind of, so I'd say that's probably another 4 inches again. We can trim them down if we need to. Okay, now we're ready to begin. So, I would say the main piece of advice to give anyone making a wreath is to work in either a clockwise or anti-clockwise motion. Now, if you did our Christmas wreath kits, you're probably bored to tears of me saying anti-clockwise or clockwise, but it's the main thing. It's the main piece of advice that's going to get you the most professional looking wreath. And by professional, I don't mean neat and tidy and kind of boring. I mean structured in a way that it looks it looks beautiful. It doesn't look sort of haphazard and sort of scruffy. It looks sort of beautifully rustic and elegant. So I personally work in a clockwise motion around my wreath, which basically means that all of the top of my sort of posies that I'm going to show you how to make point clockwise. But I lay them down on top of each other anti-clockwise. So they all face clockwise, but I lay them on top anti-clockwise. It will make sense. So your binding wire is still attached. Because I work in a clockwise motion, my binding wire is in the middle of my wreath and it's attached to my left section of my wreath. So I will show you one and then hopefully this will all make sense. So you're going to take different elements from each pile that you have. I would probably go in with a couple of pieces of pistache. I would then take some olive and pop that on top. I'd then go in with some wax flour, some genister, lay that on top, and see how that kind of sprays out to create that sort of natural feel. Then in terms of the florals, how many have we got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I would say you could probably go for 2 different stems per posy. So for my first one, I'm going to go all in with a gorgeous blue hyacinth. So this is my first posy. I'm going to lay it down on top of my wreath. So my binding wire is on the left hand side of my wreath, and the section that I'm going to make first is to the side. It's right at the side. So I'm going to lay my posy on top of my moss. I'm going to use my thumb to cover that posy. And then going to wrap my binding wire around. You can be reasonably confident, assertive and strong with it. You don't need to be delicate. It's fine. The foliage can take it and the floral's fine too. So what you're left with is a posy that's put on top of your moss. So that's your first section. So say for example that is my first section, it's on my left, sort of almost pointing upwards. Once I've done it, I will then twist. So then you're layering in a circular motion. So let's go in with our next posy. I'm going to use sort of 3 bits of this because these bits are all a bit smaller. Nice piece of olive. I've got a taller bit, a longer stem, should I say. So that's going in the middle. I'm going to pop a little bit genister in. And again, you can choose what goes on top depending on what you love the most. So for me personally, my least favourite element, although it definitely has its value, is the pistache foliage. That goes at the back because then you're not going to see it quite so much. My favourite elements are obviously the florals, so they go on top. So the genister goes there. Let's pop some wax flour. With the wax flour, if you really like the wax flour, that's actually quite a good floral to go on top at the end because it sort of cushions the soft stems from the wire. So if you want to finish off with a piece of wax flour, or even if you want to, a small piece of the pistache just to add a bit of green on top, then that would be a good move. So I'm then going to go in with a pink or salmon ranunculus, and then I might go in with a yellow Crispedia or Billy Bob, and keep that Billy Bob a little bit taller than the pink ranunculus, so they're not sort of sat on top of each other. They've got a bit of space. And add a little bit of pistache on top to show you what I mean by it sort of protecting that sort of soft stem that's underneath it. So you're going to take this next section and lay it on top of the wire of your previous posy that you've already binded to your moss. So that goes down, and then confidently you bind the wire through, up and over, and then you twist. Okay, so again, making the posies. You don't necessarily have to use the Gelister or the wax for every posy. It's completely up to you. I'm going to go in with a couple of stems there. So I've got the peachy kind of orange tulip and the white carnation. Move my Gelister back over. So with your longer elements, they are better if they're placed on the outside of your posy, so they're therefore going to be on the outside of your wreath. Okay, so that's bound. Now I twist again. Next posy. And then you lay that on top of the previous posy where you've wired it to cover the wire. Up and over, up and over. I would say maybe 2 times, with the third time going really sort of towards the end of the last stems. Sorry, and then you twist. So I'm sort of at the beginning almost of my florals. So I've used each of them, and now I'm going heading back to the first one I used, which was the blue hyacinth. That way, if you can see, you then know that you see you've got a blue hyacinth there. I'm going to have one here, and then I'll probably end up with one smaller one there. So it's almost in a triangle. Again, there's not necessarily any need to do it that way, but if you like things to be able to sort of use things and make things sort of in more of a uniform way, then that's the way to do it. Otherwise, cluster all you want. You know, you could have a whole sort of section of the blue tulip, blue hyacinths to make it really impactful. It's completely up to you. I've added another billybog or craspedia here. I'm trying to, oh, there's my other one. At the end, it's definitely worth poking your florals through, because sometimes they do get a bit covered by the foliage. Okay, so that goes on top of the wire from your previous posy, up and over, bind it to the moss a couple of times, 3 times, third time at the end of the stems. I'm going over the 4th one there. How are we looking? Okay, so we're probably a third of the way through now. So I used the blue and then I went in with the yellow and the salmon ranunculus. So let's do the same again. I'm going to go pop some of the Genista on top. Put some foliage in first. On top, just to add a different look to this posy. So this posy is slightly more white. So lay that down on top of the binding wire, wrap over, and then twist. Some wax flower. Olive. The peach. A small piece of pistachio at the top. Okay, and again on top of where you've wired previously, binding over 2-3 times and then twist. And again, always in the clockwise or anti-clockwise motion, depending on what feels comfortable for you. So that time I actually put some Genista right at the back, just so that it lays on top. So I'm going with the white. I might pop the pink in. Okay, so on top of the wire of your previous posy and wrap round. If you want to, you can put less of the foliages in so that it does feel a bit more floral. You could then use those foliages in another vase or in some bud vases or something like that. You don't have to use everything. If you want something to look a little bit more floral, then by all means, you don't have to include everything. So I'm back. I'm going with a couple of mascara now, I think. And possibly what should I use? I'm going to go with a blue hyacinth as well. Lay that on top. Bind it round and then twist. Okay. Need some more. Going in with the peachy orange tulips, a white carnation, and can do that. And then one of these little hyacinth buds, I think. Pop some wax flower on top. Back. I would would say I'm probably got 3 posies left to pop in. I work out 3 piles, because I don't want to put the foliages in the bud vase or anything. I want them all in my wreath. So I'm just going to section it all out, so I'm not going to waste anything. So I'm just dividing up the remaining elements of the foliages and the wax flower, knowing that I've probably got about 3 more posies left to add into my wreath. And the same with the floral. I go for some pink, and some mascari, and some orange in this one. The eggs go in at the end. So if you have any gaps or spaces where you want something extra, that's where you can pop them. Okay, so that's number 1, my last posies, and then twist. Oh, it's a bit of a strange shape, so I'm just going to trim that and then just add it on top. That's better. You can steal a bit of Genista from this pile. Okay, what's left? Ranunculus, hyacinth. Keep those 2 for the last. That one. Okay, we're nearly there. And twist. And then the last posy. So this is probably the most trickiest one, and I'll show you how to do it, but it's just all about trimming off the stems so that you can tuck them. It's almost underneath the first posy that you lay down. Okay. So I'm using what's left. Beautiful. If you see anything on your table that you can use, so for example there's just this little sprig of wax flower that can go in, a sprig of Genista that can go in on top, all adds to lots of texture. Okay, so I have my posy, my final posy here. Because I wanted to tuck it underneath the first posy, I'm going to hold it quite tight, and then I'm going to trim with my secateurs, probably an inch off the bottom. You then lift the first posy up slightly. you're then going to slide the last posy in underneath the first posy, so that the first posy is then covering the wire binding of the last posy. Okay, go around a few times and then we're going to cast off. So to cast off, you take your binding wire and sort of pull it a little bit so you've got a few inches, a sort of a tail. You're then going to find the top of the copper wreath ring and thread it through, much like you would do in sewing, and wrap it around and around the top loop of the wreath ring, and then just tuck that tail in. Just push it in into the moss. Okay, lay your wreath back down, and this is where we're going to add the eggs. Again, if you would like to cluster, you can pop them in one area of the wreath. I personally am going to hide the area at the top, not the top, where I've just put my last posy in, because it's never as neat when you have to tuck under and then bind. It can sometimes feel like everything's been flattened a little bit. So that's where I'm going to take my skewer with my eggs and sort of just quite simply poke it through, like that. Quite satisfying. I'm going to go in a sort of triangle motion with mine. So the next one I'm going to pop down here. Again, just at a slight angle. Again, following that motion that you've gone round with, whether it's clockwise or anti-clockwise. Point the eggs in that direction. And then my last one, I'm going to go over here. Obviously make sure that your eggs are trimmed enough so that the back of them doesn't poke through the back of the wreath and therefore risk scratching your door or anything like that. So there we have, before we hang, the finished wreath. All of the beautiful florals included. You can, at the end, manipulate your wreath a little bit should you wish. So if you find that some of the florals are being hidden by some of the foliage, if for example you want it to look more floral, you just gently bring those floral heads to the front and move the foliage to the back. I personally love the mix of flowers and foliage. I want it to look like this bit's hidden, and you know, almost every time you go through the door you notice new elements of your wreath, things in the background and different bits of texture. Okay, so now we're going to hang our wreath. So you take your piece of twine that you would have received in your wreath kits. Now, if you're doing this in a group or with friends, it's a good idea to sort of lift your wreath up and show them and say, okay, where do you think my top is? For me personally, when it's such a kind of natural rustic wreath, I don't think it really matters. I haven't clustered anything. If you were going to cluster, I'd probably say that the cluster would be sort of at the bottom, kind of almost flowing down the side. So sort of starting probably at maybe 4 o'clock on a clock and sort of going sort of down to just past 6. That's where I would cluster. So if that's the case, you would then hang at 12 o'clock. But for me personally, I don't feel like there's necessarily a sort of an obvious top, so I'm just going to hang it, I think, with 2 of the eggs sort of almost at the bottom, so the point of the triangle is near the top, but with the point of the triangle still slightly off kilter, slightly off the side. You then thread your string or your twine through to an area where you've binded a posy, so you can see that there will be an area of wire that you've obviously wrapped over your stems. That's where I would choose to thread through the string. And then you simply tie your twine near the back of your wreath in a double knot. And it is then ready for hanging. So there we have it. Your spring DIY wreath. I hope you're really delighted with what you've made. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've managed to relax, maybe had a glass of fizz or something. Please send me pictures of your wreath. I would love to see them. And do let me know if you have any questions or need any advice. Last few pointers I'd say is to water it at least every 3 days ideally. If it's raining, then you don't need to worry quite so much. Keep it away from fruit, not that you're going to have the wreath inside, sorry. But if say for example you wanted it on a table, if you had like a Sunday roast or something and you had friends coming over, you want to bring it in off your door, perfect, that's great. It won't last as long inside, obviously, because you might have your heating on, it might be warm. But if you do bring it inside, away from fruit, away from direct sun, and away from sort of a warm environment really. And you can keep spritzing, if you have a spritzer, keep spritzing it and that will make it last for longer. But ideally, have it on your front door, water it every few days, and just really enjoy it. And yeah, I look forward to seeing all of the pictures of your beautiful spring wreaths.